In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. This is our second session entitled Our Struggle, regarding the struggle of the genuine Christians of Greece against ecumenism and modernism in the 20th century and down to the 21st century. And not only our local Church of Greece, but also, by extension, all the true Orthodox and all the local churches throughout the world who have walled themselves off from innovating hierarchs because of the heresy of ecumenism or Sergianism, which we're going to deal with when we get to the Russian Church. The article we're dealing with, as we said last week, is this very excellent lecture by then hieromonk, now Bishop Maximus of our synod of the genuine Christians of Greece. And Bishop Maximus is a personal friend of mine I've known for many years, since he was novice at Jordanville and then at Ascension Monastery in Bearsville many years ago. And this article he wrote some time ago, but it's extremely lucid. So it's a very useful starting point for our course. Now, last time we got through part one. Part one dealt with the assertions of a certain Father Basil of Gregoria Monastery concerning the conditions under which one may or should separate from a heretical hierarch. And the article by Bishop Maximus in general is, or the structure of the article is a refutation of this article by Father Basil. You can find Father Basil's article on orthodoxinfo.com. It's called the Anti-Patristic Stance of the Old Calendar Zealots. And it's on Orthodox. So if you're interested in the actual text of Father Basil's article, if anyone might think Bishop Maximus is misrepresenting his position, you can go and read that article. I just want to spend time reading that article and reading this article, because Father Maximus does, in fact, honestly represent Father Basil's position in the refutation. So last time we did part one, which is about the history of and the canonical literature relating to the criteria for breaking communion with an innovating or heretical hierarch. And a lot of the argument centers around a specific canon, the Canon 15 of the First Second Council. So before we go on with Bishop Maximus's article, tonight we're going to deal with part 2, the New Calendar. Before we go on there, I want to talk about the First Second Council. I went and found, there's an excellent website, fatheralexander.org. The late Bishop Alexander Miliant of Roquefort did a very nice missionary website, fatheralexander.org, where he has a lot of short booklets perfect for the new convert or perfect for maybe a cradle Orthodox who's learning about our faith. It's excellent with a lot of short, excellent little pamphlets, sort of our answer to Chick tracts, if you want to tract, go to fatheralexander.org. But he has one on the local and regional councils, and where he collects the decrees of the local councils. And this is lifted directly. It's looking at the English of the translation. This looks like taken volume from volume 14 of the Blue series, the Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers of the Eerdmans series. So I'm handing out to our attendees tonight the hard copy. Anyone who's listening to the recording can go to fatheralexander.org and find his booklet on the local and regional councils. Now, note about local and regional councils. It's very important to note that in the church tradition, a local or regional council can receive ecumenical approval. We're not limited. Not only are the decrees of the 7 ecumenical councils binding, but in the church's tradition, if a local or regional council has found ecumenical acceptance, it also becomes part of the tradition, and it becomes, in some cases, absolutely obligatory. In other cases, very clear, almost binding guidelines for church administration and so forth. So the fact that this is a local council, the First Second was a local council, does not reduce its ecumenical authority. And why is it called First Second? Well, it has nothing to do with the First and Second ecumenical councils, which were in the 4th century. First Second, it's called First Second as kind of a nickname because the first session was interrupted by the heretics who were having fistfights and disrupting it. So they adjourned and came back at a later date when those people had been taken care of. What is this council? This council has great authority because it's presided over by St. Photius the Great. It's the first serious regional council in Constantinople after the defeat of iconoclasm. So it was attended by 318 fathers, the same number that attended the First Ecumenical Council. Okay, so it has a lot of authority, and it has authority for several reasons. One is that the representation was so broad, including legates from Pope Nicholas, who later becomes St. Photius' nemesis, or vice versa, about the filioque and papal primacy and so forth. But Pope Nicholas sent the legates because this is a very important council, because they were dealing with the manner of receiving the iconoclasts back into the church. And St. Photius represented the moderate party. The imperial government forcibly removed St. Ignatius, in which we have two saints. This happens in church history, two saints on two different sides of the same question. They're usually a disciplinary or canonical or administrative question, where St. Ignatius represented the Acrevious, or the strict party, and they wanted to rebaptize and reordain all the iconoclasts. And the emperor and the imperial government, and St. Photius, who was a great imperial administrator, went, no, this isn't going to work. We want these people back in the church, and they're willing to admit they're wrong. They're willing to be back in the church. So Bardas, who was the emperor, was a boy, and Bardas, who was his uncle, who was the effective ruler of the empire, just said, Ignatius has to go, and he went, and that's how St. Photius came to the throne, which ended up being a good thing. So St. Photius presided over this council, and so they had a lot of housekeeping to do, because this is the first serious regional council and the first imperial council, the first council in the imperial city after the defeat of the last great heresy of the first millennium, iconoclasm. So this council has tremendous authority, and the 15th canon, which is our canon that we're working with in this course, is not an isolated canon. It's what's so significant is that this is the 9th century. So this canon represents the first 800 years the church is thinking about this topic, right? Because obviously these are highly conservative, highly traditional, highly erudite churchmen who are going back and looking at the entire canonical literature, looking at all of church history, and summarizing these criteria for breaking communion within this canon. So this canon isn't some isolated, it isn't like this is some regional council in Visigothic Spain, where a bunch of these Latin bishops got together and made something up off in the corner somewhere. This is in the imperial city under the presidency of St. Photius, the greatest saints and greatest minds of all time. And it represents the culmination, this canon represents the culmination of the church's thinking after 800 years of dealing with this topic of heresy and when you have to separate from a bishop. So I'll read the canon again. And the canon starts with what you're not allowed to do, and then it says what you're allowed to do. Okay, and that's with many canons. They say this is what you're allowed to do, this is what you must not do, and this is what you should do, or vice versa. Okay. The rules laid down with reference to presbyters and bishops and metropolitans are still more applicable to patriarchs. So in any case, any presbyter or bishop or metropolitan dares to secede or apostatize from the communion of his own patriarch and fails to mention the latter's name in accordance with custom duly fixed and ordained in the divine mystagogy, but before a conciliar verdict has been pronounced and has passed judgment against him, creates a schism. The Holy Council has decreed that this person shall be held an alien to every priestly function if only he be convicted of having committed this transgression of the law. Accordingly, these rules have been sealed and ordained as respecting those persons who are under the pretext of charges against their own presidents stand aloof and create a schism and disrupt the union of the church. Okay, so that's the first part, where it's if your patriarch, or in the case of if you're a priest, your bishop has been accused of a moral or a administrative transgression. He's committed a sin worthy of deposition, or he has gone against the canons and performed unauthorized ordinations or things like that. You may not separate from him until he's actually been tried in a legitimate canonical process and been deposed. Now, this is important. This first part, here we're mostly polemicizing against the new calendars, right? But the first part of this canon is very important for us old calendarists, because in the history of true Orthodox movements, we have a lot of schisms created by people simply on the basis of saying, well, you did something uncanonical. You did something, not acceptable. You committed some sin. You're a sodomite. You're unjust, and we're going to create a whole new synod because Bishop so and so did such and such. And this is very anarchic activity, and this has been the bane of the old calendar church. Fortunately, now we're at a point of stability, mainly at least in our local Greek church. But it's very important to remember that this is equally important, right? That we have to avoid schism as well as heresy. Now let's go on now to the canon that pertains to our current author's article. But as for those persons who, on the other hand, who on account of some heresy condemned by the holy councils of the fathers, withdrawing themselves from communion with their president, who, that is to say, is preaching the heresy publicly and teaching it bareheaded in the church, such persons not only are not subject to any canonical penalty on account of their having walled themselves off from any and all communion with the one called a bishop, before any conciliar or synodical verdict has been rendered, but on the contrary, they shall be deemed worthy to enjoy the honor which befits them among Orthodox Christians, for they have defied not bishops, but pseudo-bishops and pseudo-teachers prior to conciliar verdict. Right? And they have not sundered the union of the church with any schism, but on the contrary, have been sedulous to rescue the church from schisms and divisions. So those who separate on account of heresy are not schismatics. So it's always hurled at us by apologists for the official hierarchies, or I say officially, recognized by the government or by the media or by the World Economic Forum or somebody, but the so-called official churches. What's always hurled at us is that we're schismatic. But if you separate on the basis of the defense of Orthodox against heresy, if it's clearly it's very clear that the bishop in question or the synod in question is in heresy, has preached heresy, or is in communion with heresy over a period of time. They've been reproached, rebuked many times. So they themselves have issued articles condemning ecumenism, but they're still in ecumenism. Then you are not a schismatic. You've done this in order to stay in the church, right? So that's the impact of that canon. Note that following the canon are references to earlier councils, earlier canons. Apostolic Canon 31, which our author referred to last time. Canon 18 of the Fourth Council, Canons 31, 34 of the Sixth, Canons 12, 13, 14 of the First and Second, Canon 5 of Antioch, Canon 6 of Gondra, Canons 10, 11, and 62 of Carthage. The Carthaginian councils were held during the baptism controversies in the 3rd century, and also later there were Carthaginian councils held during the Donatist controversies. Okay. They're also an important part of the canonical tradition in the Carthaginian canons. All right, so that's the First and Second Council. So you can use this as a reference, go back and reference that canon as we're talking about these things. All right, let's go on to part 2 of our author's article, The New Calendar. The issue of the church's calendar dates back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. At that time, there were very few feasts of the saints except for local celebrations. The calendar was used primarily to determine the date of Pascha and its attendant feasts. So in the early church, there was Sunday and there was Pascha. Right? And then as martyrdoms occurred in different places, the cult of that saint would spring up in that place. And we see the earliest testimony in the martyrdom of St. Polycarp of Smyrna. Very important from the middle of the 2nd century. In the beginning of the 2nd century, a controversy arose concerning the practice of certain churches in Asia Minor of celebrating Pascha on the same day as the Jews, the 14th of Nisan. Okay, so that's established in the book of Exodus, right? Of course, in Exodus it's called Aviv. Nisan is the post-exilic name for the month. So if you go to the source, which is in Exodus, they call it Aviv. But we say Nisan because that's the post-exilic term that came into church usage. And not on the following Sunday, together with the other Christian churches. So the whole Christian world was celebrating on the Sunday after the Passover, but these churches in Asia Minor, including very important churches, including Ephesus, and including Smyrna, very important apostolic sees, were celebrating on 14 Nisan at the same time as the Jews. The issue was important because the church expresses its inward unity through a common celebration of feasts, right? Lex orandi, lex credendi. The lack of a common celebration ultimately betrayed a lack of a common faith. This led Pope Victor of Rome to excommunicate the aberrant churches. This is in the middle of the 3rd century. Excuse me, this is in the at the beginning of the 2nd century. I'm sorry. This led Pope Victor of Rome to excommunicate the aberrant churches. Eventually, the church declared the Quartodecimans, the 14 Nisan people, as heretics, and they were received back into the church through chrismation. Canon 7 of the Council of Laodicea declares, persons converted from heresy, said as Quartodecimans, shall not be received until they have anathematized every heresy, and particularly that in which they were held. Having been anointed with a chrism, shall so communicate the holy mysteries. So Quartodecimans had to be chrismated. Canon 7 of the Second Ecumenical Council testifies that Quartodecimanism was recognized as a heresy. Quote, those who from heresy turn to orthodoxy receive according to the following method and custom. The Quartodecimans receive upon their giving a written renunciation, anathematizing every heresy. Thereupon they are first sealed or anointed with holy oil. Finally, Canon 95 of the Quinisext Council. Quinisext refers to a disciplinary council held at the end of the 7th century, because the 5th and 6th ecumenical councils only dealt with dogmatic issues. They did not deal with housekeeping. So there was an administrative council held, it's also called the Council in Trullo. You heard the term Trullo. It's held in I believe, the 690s. Called the Trullo because it's held under a dome, a building that had a dome in Constantinople, a Trullo. It's a very important disciplinary council, just as our 1st and 2nd later was. Finally, Canon 95 of the Quinisext Council, which possesses ecumenical authority, declares, Quartodecimans we receive in the presentation of certificates and their anathematization of every heresy, which not hold as does the Holy Apostolic Church of God. And first of all, we anoint them with holy chrism in their foreheads, eyes, nostrils, mouth, and ears, and as we seal them, we say the seal of the gift of the Holy Spirit, so a full chrismation. Okay. The Quartodecimans were guilty of nothing other than using a different calendar from the rest of the church, a calendar which they claimed had been given them by John the theologian himself, yet the church utterly cut them off and considered them to be heretics. St. Hippolytus testifies to the purity of their faith in all other respects. St. Hippolytus is important, again, a 2nd century writer from the Roman church. He wrote in Greek, but he's a priest of the Roman church. Certain other ones, contentious by nature, say that Pascha should be kept on the 14th day of the 1st month, according to the commandment of the law, regardless of what day of the week it may occur. In other respects, however, these persons consent to all the traditions delivered to the church by the apostles. And at one point, St. Irenaeus, who came from Asia Minor, who grew up a Quartodeciman, and then was translated to the See of Lyon in Gaul, he begged the Pope for clemency for these people. So they have the same faith as we do. Don't be too strict with them, right? And yet the church's canonical tradition ends up being very strict. Of course, as centuries go on, there's less and less excuse, right, for this, right? Anatolius, another early writer, likewise testifies concerning the Quartodecimans. The one party indeed kept the Paschal day on the 14th of the 1st month. In accordance with the gospel, as they understood it, they added nothing of an extraneous kind, but kept the rule of faith through all things. They were completely orthodox in every other respect. Okay. By the way, in our own ethnic tradition or history, who's some other people who ended up getting separated from the Catholic Church because of their insistence on their own Paschal date?
The Church of Ireland?
Yes, the Irish.
Yes.
And also some stubborn Celtic types in the north of England and in Scotland, right? So the ones who rejected the Council of Whitby. So the Irish were exemplary piety, and otherwise in all things completely orthodox. But they rejected the Roman Paschalion, or by Roman the universal or ecumenical Paschalion. So they ended up. Of course, eventually they adopted it. Eventually the Irish Church did adopt the Paschalion, but it was considered it's considered a schism. You know, I'm not sure if the Council of Whitby, if their decrees indicate that it was considered a heresy, as some of these canons say, but it was extremely serious. Okay. So our author goes on. In other words, a disagreement about church order ultimately came to be regarded as a heresy. Though the Quartodecimans were orthodox with respect to every dogma, deviated only in their particular reckoning of Pascha, they were cut off from the church as heretics, and they refused to submit to the judgment of the local and ecumenical councils. Now, of course, to the modern mind, this seems cruel or extreme, right? Because in the modern mind, calendars are an arbitrary construct But to the traditional or ancient mind, a calendar is an icon of the cosmic order. It's from God, you see. So it has to be dealt with very carefully. Of course, the human mind's involved in perceiving and then codifying that order in terms human beings can understand. Once it's codified, you don't touch it unless except in great need, because because the life, unlike the post-industrial life, pre-industrial life, was so tied up with the seasons and with the sanctification of the cycle of the day and the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of the year, and so forth. So that's why to none of these people, these are canons done over centuries. And to the ancient mind, none of this seems strange. Even when St. Irenaeus was pleading for mercy, he wasn't saying they're not wrong. He's just saying, please make it as easy for them as possible to stay in union with the church. But he wasn't disputing the principle of the importance of the calendar, and especially the Paschalion. Okay. So much were they considered heretics that they were received by chrismation and not merely by written renunciation, permitted to the Monophysites and Nestorians, who are indubitable heretics. That's the interesting thing. Monophysites and Nestorians were received simply by alivelos, by written renunciation, but the Quartodecimans had to be chrismated because it's considered such a deviation from church order. Okay. If the Quartodecimans were reckoned heretics for following a calendar tradition established by St. John the Theologian, then what of the new calendarists who follow a calendar devised by the Papists, by Gregory XIII and his Renaissance scientists, quote unquote? Whenever you see scientists associated with the Renaissance mind, think the occult. think alchemy. These people were just on the very, like some of our so-called scientists today, right? They're on the very cusp of some kind of occult knowledge, right? And occult motivations. Okay. The new calendarists who follow a calendar devised by the Papists and repeatedly condemned by the entire church. He goes on, Father Maximus goes on. The First Ecumenical Council definitively fixed the date for Pascha, but some of the Western churches, due to poor communications, continued to use outdated systems. Oh, here he goes. Here he comes to our ancestors. To use outdated systems of calculating the feast. Most of the local churches corrected themselves when they realized the error, but the Celtic churches in the British Isles refused to adopt the Paschalion. I say our ancestors because I'm part Welsh, but probably most of us Britishers have some blood from these people, right? These wonderful Celtic people. The Celtic churches in the British Isles refused to adopt the Paschalion used by the Universal Church. A heated controversy arose between the proponents of each side, with the result that the church ultimately considered the British churches schismatic until they accepted the correct calendar. So they didn't all accept the Council of Whitby. Very important council. One day we should do a course on the Church of the British Isles. But we'll get back to that later date. In 1583, here's Pope Gregory. That's a typo. It's not the 8th, it's the 13th. Pope Gregory the 13th. That's a typo on the website. Created a new calendar which he imposed on the Roman Catholic world as the sole calendar to be used for both secular and ecclesiastical purposes. He then called upon, of course, and at that time they would not conceive of having a separate secular and ecclesiastical calendar. If that's the church's calendar, it must be the calendar that everybody's going to use, right? Because everybody was a Christian, right? They still had, even though Christendom was breaking apart in the 16th century, they still had the concept of Christendom. Okay? He then called upon the Orthodox and the Protestants to adopt his new calendar. Both the Orthodox and the Protestants rebuffed him, and the Orthodox Church proceeded to hold 3 pan-Orthodox councils which anathematized the new calendar and any who should dare to adopt it. The first of these 3 councils, which convened without delay in 1583, right away, drew up a list of papist errors which were then anathematized. The 7th article, the Sigillion, the resolution, declares, "Whosoever does not follow the customs of the church, which the 7 holy ecumenical councils have decreed, and the holy Pascha and calendar which they have enacted well for us to follow, but wants to follow the newly invented Paschalion and the new calendar of the atheist astronomers of the Pope." They weren't tossing out atheist as an arbitrary insult. They regarded the learning that was going on among these people as being directed against divine revelation. These are humanists. These are alchemists. These are occultists. These are people playing games with God. Okay, of course the 16th century is nadir of the late 15th and early 16th and most of the 16th century is the nadir of the worldliness of the papacy, right? Yeah, I remember. I don't know if you remember when I from Orthodox survival course, but Father Seraphim Rose points out that Pope Paul, who convened the Council of Trent, decided the days the council would meet by consulting his astrologers. Okay, this is the same era, right here. This is the Catholics talk the glorious Council of Trent, right? The conservative traditional Council of Trent. And the Pope consulted the astrologers to set the dates on which the sessions were held. Okay. I'm sorry. Let me go back and read. I couldn't resist talking about that. Okay. Go back and let's read the entire anathema. Whosoever does not follow the customs of the Church, which the 7 holy ecumenical councils have decreed, and the Holy Pascha and the calendar, which they have enacted well for us to follow, but wants to follow the newly invented Paschalion and the new calendar of the atheist astronomers of the Pope, and opposing them wishes to overthrow and destroy the doctrines and customs of the Church, which we have inherited from our fathers. Let any such have the anathema, let him be outside of the Church and the assembly of the faithful. Now notice that the fathers of this Pan-Orthodox Council recognize that the calendar change has a telos, it has a purpose, which is the overthrow and destruction of the doctrines and customs of the Church. It's not an isolated or arbitrary or secondary question. It's a wedge. It's a shot across the bow, right? To overturn the custom. The Pope is saying, I am the master of the universe, so to speak, and I have the power to do these things. I can overthrow, informed by science, right? Follow the science. I'm following the science. Okay. Our author goes on. The new calendarists clearly fall under this anathema, and it is for this reason that those who have remained loyal to Orthodoxy reject communion with the new calendarists. Okay. Obviously, in the villages in Greece or Romania in 1924, it was among the peasantry and perhaps the lower clergy. It was just their instinctive hatred of innovation, their instinctive clinging to their customs. But obviously, at the top level, these very erudite churchmen in the 1920s, who were and very zealous clergymen, they understood that there were theological issues involved. So this wasn't just a peasant revolt, right? Even though in Greece we didn't have episcopal leadership till the 30s, there were certainly priests, clergymen involved who understood the theology. And the man, as I said last time, the man who understood the theology most clearly was Chrysostom Papadopoulos, who instituted the new calendar as Archbishop of Athens. But he had not long before written a definitive refutation and denunciation of the new calendar. So it was well understood on theological and canonical grounds that this is impermissible, even by one of the men who eventually enacted the new calendar. Okay. The resolutions of this council have never been abrogated by a council of equal or greater authority. These resolutions must be binding, for if local churches can overturn rulings of the Church Universal at will, the part becomes greater than the whole, and the Catholicity of the Church disappears. The innovation of an inferior council overrules the long-established Orthodox tradition explicitly defended and imposed by the superior Pan-Orthodox Council, and the whole concept of tradition and authority in the Church loses its connection to the conciliar process. Okay, so these are Pan-Orthodox councils. They were accepted by the Church for centuries. There was no reason to overturn them. Right? It was an arbitrary act to overturn them. Okay, assertion 5 by Father Basil Grigoriatis. This is what Father Basil claims. The old calendarists justified their separation from the new calendar church by accusing that church of accepting the heresy of ecumenism. But historically, they split off not because of ecumenism, but because of the change of the calendar, which is not a heresy. Therefore, even if ecumenism is a heresy, the old calendarists are still schismatic because they split off for entirely different reasons. For them to use ecumenism to justify an earlier schism is revisionist history. Because he was saying, in 1924, there's no ecumenism. You guys are sick because the calendar's not a dogma. So now we're raging ecumenists, but still, you're still schismatics. Because you did it before we became raging ecumenists. So you have nowhere to go, right? You're either with the raging ecumenists or you're with the schismatics. It's a lose-lose. No wonder so many of the conservative new calendarists are so depressed. Reply. The new calendar of its very nature promotes schism and violates the unity of the Church, but such that those who adopt the new calendar are intrinsically in a state of schism from those who retain the Church's calendar. is also in and of itself. Because remember, schism, they might say, well, wait a second. We're not in schism because we can celebrate with Moscow. We can celebrate with Jerusalem. See, but the schism isn't only on a horizontal level in a political sense, in an outward sense. It's schism from the tradition, it's schism from the church in heaven. Right? Schism from the fathers. Schism from the church. Right? The church isn't determined by numbers, and isn't determined by the name of the see, or how many people are at a given celebration. It's determined by who's in communion with the church, which is in heaven and on earth, and which at any given time may have larger or smaller numbers.
And even the ecumenists are internally inconsistent, because you have the Greek New Calendar Church, and then you have Moscow, and Moscow still celebrates the fixed feasts on the old calendar.
Yes.
So you have a situation where they're supposedly in communion, they're supposedly in the same church, but they're celebrating Christmas and Theophany and Dormition on different dates.
They are, but what is even worse than that, see, that's bad. But what's worse than that is when the same bishop will celebrate this feast twice. Mm-hmm. And Patriarch Bartholomew does this. Because when he goes to Mount Athos, he celebrates with the Athenites on the old calendar. Mm. So
even the Athenites who are still in communion with Bartholomew are still on the old calendar?
Absolutely. All of Athos is on still, so far. Mm-hmm. So far, they're on the old calendar. Mm-hmm. I mean, who knows what's to come, because they compromised so many other things. But, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Or I think even when the Patriarch goes to certain islands or certain churches in Asia Minor, I think some are still in the old calendar, and they'll celebrate on the old calendar. But that shows indifferentism. See, that's worse. That's worse than just there being a difference. It's the calendar doesn't matter. It's indifferentism. You see, and that's not a good thing. Okay. Now we have to admit that there was a short period in the Russian Church abroad where some very anti-communist Romanians who came from the New Calendar Church of Romania were taken into the Russian Church abroad in the emergency situation of their fleeing the communist revolution and being specifically anti-communist, which the Church abroad was very sympathetic to, because these men had suffered so much, right? And they allowed them by economy to keep the new calendar for a period of time, but they said, there's going to be an expiration date. So some of our hierarchs would go and celebrate with them. When I say our, I mean the Russian hierarchs would go and celebrate with them. But they said, this has got to stop. At some point, it's understood that if you're going to stay with us, you have to switch. And they said, no, we don't want to switch, and they went and joined the OCA. So that's the origin of the OCA Romanians. They really were Russian Church abroad Romanians, or were. And then when confronted with, okay, all right, enough's enough, you have to use the old calendar. They just went. They remained anti-communist, but they went with the North American Metropolia, which later became the OCA, because they were allowed. Even though the Metropolia was still in the old calendar then, they allowed them to keep the new calendar. Okay. So let me go back to Bishop Maximus's argument. The new calendar, to repeat, the new calendar of its very nature promotes schism and violates the unity of the church, such that those who adopt the new calendar are intrinsically in a state of schism from those who retain the church's calendar. And also, in and of itself, potentially heretical, because it is an alteration of a sacred symbol the fathers have passed down to us. The church everywhere expresses sacred reality through symbols. Symbols are created things which represent that which is uncreated, thus making the uncreated and divine intelligible to us. That's what I was talking about earlier, right? The modern mind can't grasp that every created essence has a symbolic function. And especially long-standing customs of the church or symbols of the church, you don't touch with a 10-foot pole except in very great necessity. Right? And there was absolutely no necessity to change the calendar. There was absolutely none whatsoever. It was obviously done. They were mendacious. They lied to their teeth. They were doing it to bring about ecumenism. Or actually, they didn't lie, because in 1920 they said they were. They said they were. They started lying later on, but in 1920 they were very clear about why they were doing it. Okay. So let me repeat: the church everywhere expresses sacred reality through symbols. Symbols are created things which represent that which is uncreated, thus making the uncreated and divine intelligible to us. They do not represent God's essence, since the divine essence is entirely inexpressible and super-exalted above all reality, but they point the way to actualizing the divine in our life by portraying his energies. That is, symbols show us how and by what mental conceptions we may become receptacles of God's grace and indwelling energy. Here, Bishop Maximus is drawing upon his intensive study of his saint, St. Maximus the Confessor. This is Maximus the Confessor coming out here. The Church uses verbal and written symbols, often adapted from classical philosophy, true, to signify truths concerning the Godhead, the Incarnation, and other doctrines. For example, we say that God is one in essence, but three in hypostases, though the reality this formula attempts to express is in fact infinitely loftier than this verbal expression. Remember, dogmatic definitions do not define the reality, they define the boundaries of the language we're allowed to use about the reality. Right? The reality is always, if it's God, it's always loftier, right? Infinitely loftier than the expression itself. We also borrow symbols from poetry and metaphors, such as when we say that God is a consuming fire. Although he is in actuality not a physical fire at all, of course. Such a formula creates the correct conception in our minds, which God knows is most useful for us in the spiritual life. For he works in those he deems worthy in a manner likened unto fire, for example. In the same way, the Church's calendar, according to the Fathers, is an icon of the eternal worship of God in heaven. The Church expresses the everlasting aspect of the age to come by arranging her services in a series of cycles, inasmuch as a circle is an image of that which does not end. Each of these circles, in which the cycle of the year is a created image of the endless nature of the heavenly kingdom, of infinity, of eternity. Okay? That's why, so in the Christian revelation, okay, in the pagan conception, the time is cyclical. The cycles are endless, right? In the Christian conception, the cycle is merely a symbol of eternity. We're going to break through to eternity. So that the cyclical nature of the seasons and of the liturgical year is a symbol of eternity. Each of these cycles moves in perfect concordance with one another, producing a rhythm that brings the soul into harmony with itself, with its fellow members in Christ, with the incarnate Word himself. However, when the calendar is arbitrarily altered to conform to a heretical model, this series of cycles is disrupted and a spiritual discordance results. Perhaps the most outrageous example of this in the present application is how the new calendar shortens the Apostles' Fast, sometimes even eliminating it altogether. When Pascha is late, the new calendars have no Apostles' Fast, or maybe a 1 or 2 day Apostles' Fast. Okay? They end up having the Apostles, like the same time as Pentecost. It makes a joke out of the whole thing. And remember that one of the methods of subversion is to make light of important things. To signal, this isn't important. That isn't important. It's important. Now the Three Stooges approach to interpreting reality, right? Everything's a joke. And we know, I've known and my parishioners have known New Calendar clergymen who do literally make fun of the church calendar, the church year, the church dogmas, all kinds of things. Church, especially the fasts and the church's discipline. Right? Perhaps the most outrageous example of this in the present application is how the new calendar shortens the Apostles' Fast, sometimes even eliminating it altogether, thereby depriving the faithful of one of the basic tools used to advance in the spiritual life. Not keeping the Apostles' Fast really shows how serious you are about the orthodoxy. And the Apostles' Fast has so completely disappeared from the mind of the New Calendar Greeks in this country that even elderly people often don't know it exists. I'll give an example. I had an elderly Greek parishioner in Denver. She went to our Russian parish, but she grew up in the Greek Archdiocese. When I knew her in the 90s, she was already in her 70s. And she had, but she came when her son joined the Russian church abroad, or actually originally the Serbian church, then the Russian church abroad. She came over and joined us, became an old calendar. And she and an elderly cousin, a male cousin, had the habit of lunching together. And sometime after she became old calendar, he invited her to lunch. And she said, well, I have to go to such and such a restaurant because we're fasting now. He said, fast? What fast? She said, the Apostles' Fast. He said, the Apostles' Fast? He said, you've changed your religion. You're not a Greek Orthodox anymore. Who ever heard of that? These were elderly people. They were born in the 1920s, right? So they so effectively eliminated the entire phronima, you see, by that time, that they really, in a sad, ironic way, he was right. She had changed her religion. She had become an Orthodox Christian. Okay. Our author goes on, every aspect of the church's self-expression, be it theology, poetry, liturgy, the calendar, architecture, music, iconography, the sacraments, or anything else, is a symbol of heavenly realities and is such fundamentally unalterable. For a correct symbol leads us to worship God correctly and follows the commandments properly, while an incorrect symbol leads us away from God. If a symbol is ever legitimately altered, or if the church allows for several variants on the same theme, this is because the saints understood that there are several different symbols capable of expressing the same reality. But if a symbol is altered without the approval of the saints, or worse, against the explicit, consistent condemnation of the universal church, which is the case here, right, then that innovation must be rejected as destructive to the soul. What I really like about this argument from Bishop Maximus is that he's relating this to the very core conceptions of the role of sacrament and symbol in spiritual life.
And in salvation.
And ultimately, of course, because it's salvation. So this is a very profound, and it's a compunctionate, really, argument, right? Because it's calling us to repentance, it's calling us to salvation, right? In any case, the new calendar was introduced precisely to foster ecumenism. Yeah. This is readily apparent from the fact that the first official document issued by an Orthodox patriarchate endorsing the new calendar was also the first public declaration of ecumenist beliefs and schemes. Schemes indeed. In 1920, the Patriarchate of Constantinople published an encyclical entitled To the Churches of Christ, Wheresoever They Might Be. Wheresoever they might be. In other words, it was not addressed to the Orthodox churches only, but also to Protestants and the Catholics. This encyclical presented a list of 11 proposals to further the union of the churches, the very first of which was the adoption of a single calendar for all the churches, Orthodox and heretical, to celebrate feasts simultaneously. And they put this into action. Patriarch Bartholomew goes to Rome on the Feast of St. Peter and Paul. The Pope sends a legate, or in the case of Pope Benedict, comes personally to Constantinople for the Feast of St. Andrew, and it's on the same date. 3 years later, Patriarch Meletius Metaxakis of Constantinople, a high-ranking Freemason and radical ecumenist, convened a Pan-Orthodox Congress, but attended by representatives of only 3 Orthodox churches. It wasn't really Pan-Orthodox. Just like Bartholomew's joke of a council in Crete in 2016, it wasn't really Pan-Orthodox. Which recommended that in order to modernize the church and achieve union with the Western denominations, the church ought to adopt the Gregorian calendar and Paschalian, drastically reduce the length of the fasts and church services, and abolish clerical garb. So it's part of an entire modernist program. The people who instituted the new calendar understood it as part and parcel, an integral part of an entire modernist program. They weren't concerned about astronomical accuracy and all that. That's all later backfill. Right? The next year, the Patriarchate of Constantinople and the churches of Greece and Romania adopted the new calendar. The advocates, and by the way, Romania never had a patriarchate. The Patriarchate of Romania is a modern invention, and the first patriarch was a uniate, where he came over formally to Orthodoxy in order to be patriarch. And the deal was Constantinople would give them their tomos of autocephaly and their patriarchate if they would adopt the new calendar. So the Patriarchate of Romania was conceived in sin. Actually Romania then celebrated on the new Paschalian for a couple of years. Thank God they stopped that, but it's really bad. So then the next year, the Patriarchate of Constantinople and the churches of Greece and Romania adopted the new calendar. The advocates of the new calendar in the 1920s made no attempt to hide the purpose of the calendar change. They were not hiding it. They're not like our conservative new calendars who make up excuses for it. They were making no excuses. They were proud of it. They wanted it. They were going for it. They explicitly declared, both officially and privately, that the reason for adopting the new calendar was to facilitate union with the Western churches. This fact was known to the old calendarists of the time, of course. It was in large measure because of the calendar change was the first step in the union with the Papists and the Anglicans that the Orthodox rejected it. Indeed, the very text of the 1583 condemnation of the new calendar recognizes that those who favor changing the calendar are precisely those who want the Orthodox Church to unite with the papacy. So it is idle to argue that the issue of ecumenism did not arise until decades after the calendar change. The two go hand in hand. There's no separating the calendar change from ecumenism. I can't believe Father Basil, who wrote that other article, didn't know that. He's a learned Athonite monk. How could he not know that? By the way, getting back to this character of Meletius Metaxakis, notorious character, look him up. He was a high-ranking Freemason. We have photographs of him in his Masonic garb. He was praised in Masonic magazines. He had tried to be, I forget, he tried to be patriarch in several places. He had succeeded. I think he was once patriarch of Alexandria, and he wanted Jerusalem at one point. He was quite a character. And of course, we're talking about the end of World War I. We're talking about the influence or the control of British Freemasonry and British, as a part and parcel of British foreign policy at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, dealing with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. We're talking about British Englishmen and Turks, actually Turks usually of Jewish ethnic origin, being in the Masonic Lodge together. Okay, so there are Turkish Freemasons, British Freemasons, and they're all collaborating to bring about the modernization and secularization of Turkey and the destruction of the Orthodox culture in the Levantine and Balkan countries. So that's the historical context. If you saw the movie about St. Nectarius, man of God, the archbishop in Greece, who's playing both sides of the fence and who keeps putting him off and lying to him, that's Meletius Metaxakis. That's before he becomes patriarch. St. Nectarius proposed in 1920, so Metaxakis was in Greece, running the show there in Greece for a while before he got the throne in Constantinople. So that obviously worldly, they show him, feasting and being such a politician. That's Meletius Metaxakis. They don't say that in the movie, but you can see in the credits at the end, the actor that plays and that says who's he playing, Meletius. And that's the man. So, assertion 6 by Father Basil Grigoriatis. The condemnation of the new calendar by the Pan-Orthodox councils of the 16th century, the condemnation does not apply to the modern new calendar, since the modern new calendars have only changed the Menologian, not the Paschalian as well. Okay, that's another argument. We've only changed the fixed dates, but not the Paschalian. And the anathema only refers to the Paschalian. Okay, response by Father Maximus. Anyone who reads the text of the condemnations can see that these councils condemn not only those who adopt the errors of the Latins altogether, but those who accept even one of them individually. Such an error is the new Menologian. If one were to claim that the Church can accept the new Menologian as long as it does not accept the new Paschalian, by the same logic, one would have to confess the Church can accept papal supremacy or the Azymes as long as it does not simultaneously accept the Filioque. And that's the method of subversion, right? It's incremental. You boil the frog slowly. Okay. But away with such absurdity, our author says. Away with such absurdity. The wording of the text puts the Paschalian and the Menologian precisely the same footing. Indeed, there is no reason to judge the two according to different standards, since both are integral and necessary expressions of the inner life of the Church. And we know, any one of us who's prepared the services knows you're always consulting both, that they are an integral unity. They're always interacting with each other. Right? This coming Sunday is so many Sundays after Pentecost, so that's the Paschalian. But it's this Manean date. And therefore you have this combination of hymns and so forth. Right? The two are integrally bound. The Church's Typicon is a magnificent structure. It's one of the most beautiful intellectual constructions in history because it's inspired by the Holy Spirit and written and constructed by saints. And so, even from an artist's point of view, this freakish Frankenstein basing together of a new Paschalian with the old Menologian is even disgusting from an artistic point of view and from an intellectual point of view. Even a person with intellectual integrity wouldn't have anything to do with it, right? It should be noted that the churches of Finland and Estonia, which have adopted the new Paschalian, certainly fall under the condemnation not only of the councils of the 16th century, which declared them outside the church and the assembly of the faithful, but also the First Ecumenical Council, which established the Paschalian and forbade anyone to celebrate Pascha with the Jews, as occasionally happens on the papal calendar. Actually, it happens quite often. When Pascha is a week later than the Catholics, that's because they're celebrating during the Jewish Passover. So the Orthodox Pascha gets moved back a week. So we either have the same Pascha as the Latins because because it is the first Sunday after the full moon after the spring equinox and on the old calendar, and it falls after Pascha, and they end up being on the same day. Okay, because the lunar cycles are such that there's no that the difference between the conventional equinox of March 21st, the Julian calendar, and the astronomical equinox doesn't make any difference. It just, because the lunar cycle is such that we can have it on the same day as the Latins, and it's also after the Jewish Passover. And then most years it's a week difference, and that's because they're celebrating during the Jewish Passover before it's ended. And some years it's a 5-week difference, and that's because the lunar calendar's cycle in combination with the difference in the two equinoxes, the Gregorian and the Julian equinoxes, is such that it gets kicked back a whole cycle of the moon. So it becomes a 5-week difference. But that's rare. That's only every few years. It doesn't happen that often. Okay. Therefore, according to the dicta accepted by the New Calendarists themselves, wanted to break communion with those two churches. Even the New Calendarists who say, well, we're on the old Paschalian, say, yeah, but you're still in communion with Finland. And they're on the new Paschalian. Finland, by the way, is the most advanced. They're even promoting a gay agenda and stuff like that. Which is not so. That's interesting, isn't it? That the ones who adopt the new Paschalian, are the first to promote the gay agenda, right? Because that modernist phronema just keeps going. It's like an avalanche. It just picks up speed and it gets worse and worse, as things go on. Okay, assertion 7. The new calendar used. This is Father Basil attacking us. The new calendar used by the Orthodox Church is not the Gregorian calendar. This is your question, George, from last time. The new calendar used by the Orthodox Church is not the Gregorian calendar, but the revised Julian calendar. It's the revised Julian calendar. What does Shakespeare say about a rose by the name, right? In this case, something less fragrant. The new calendar used by the Orthodox Church is not the Gregorian calendar, but the revised Julian calendar. It differs from the Gregorian calendar in that it is slightly more accurate, having only 97 leap years as opposed to 100 every 400 years. Thus, the Orthodox who follow the revised Julian calendar do not fall under the anathemas against the Gregorian calendar. I wonder if they had Jesuits or Talmud professors advising them when they made such an argument. Reply. The new calendar is functionally identical. And this is the point. The new calendar is functionally identical to the Gregorian calendar, anathematized in 1583. It differs only in taking the principle behind the Gregorian calendar a step further away from the Julian calendar. That is, the atheist astronomers of the Pope, to use the phrase of the anathema, invented a new calendar because, unlike the Holy Fathers, they felt that astronomical accuracy was more important than tradition or the unity of the Church. Following in the Pope's footsteps, the new calendars likewise ignored tradition and the unity of the Church in favor of so-called astronomical accuracy and unity with the heretics. But since Greek intellectuals of the 1920s suffered from an inferiority complex vis-a-vis the West, which they still do, Greeks still have an inferiority complex. That's one of the reasons why all these changes have happened in the Church, right? They altered the Gregorian calendar slightly to make it even more accurate, thus proving to themselves that their atheist astronomers were superior to the Pope's atheist astronomers. Our atheist astronomers are even better. You think you've got atheist astronomers, we've got better atheist astronomers, right? It'd be more accurate to call the new calendar the revised Gregorian calendar rather than the revised Julian calendar, since it plainly is a version of the former and not the latter. The fathers of the Church who battled Arianism proved that the Son is of one essence to the Father by showing that his operations are the same as the Father's. For that which is identical operations has an identical essence. Since the operations of the new calendar are identical to those of the papal calendar, that is, they both celebrate the same feasts and the same days, that being the purpose of the common church calendar, it is clear that the new calendar is essentially the calendar instituted by the Pope and anathematized by the Orthodox. It's so obvious, right? Varying only in an incidental way. Furthermore, since the chief reason the ecumenists introduced the new calendar was to facilitate union with Rome, and it was to hinder union with Rome that the papal calendar was anathematized in 1583, it should be evident to all but the most extreme formalist that the modern new calendarists fall under the anathema of the Orthodox patriarchs. The incidental differences between the original Gregorian calendar and the new calendarist revised Gregorian calendar are practically invisible, except to a specialist, right? You'd have to be someone who is aware of the astronomical calculations to even realize they were. And the difference is only going to show up after centuries or something like that. It's functionally, it accomplishes what the encyclical of 1920 was proposing, which is having the same feasts with the Pope. All right, we've been going for about an hour, and we're finishing part 2, so I think it's a good place to pause. Now, do we have any questions or points of discussion or observations?
Seems like the bulk of the new calendarists' arguments against the old calendarists are based on technicalities.
There are either technicalities, in the case of the more intellectual ones, they're technicalities. In the case of the non-intellectual or the non-learned, they are emotional or superficial. Yes, but when learned men go head to head, usually the new calendarists or the World Orthodox apologists don't want to debate so much because they know that they don't really have good refutations of these positions. So they end up just throwing mud at us. Well, you guys separate, which he's going to address later in this article. You guys have so many separations, divisions. You guys are the minority. When the New York Times says orthodoxy, they mean Patriarch Bartholomew. So it must be Patriarch Bartholomew, right? That's what everybody says. So
I think one of the great hurdles in accepting the truth of the old calendar, the genuine Orthodox position, is that it entails recognizing the extraordinary and unprecedented historical situation of the Church.
yes,
So that anybody who brings themselves to accept the genuine Orthodox
right.
tradition has to recognize that they're living in a world in which 95% of the people calling themselves Eastern Orthodox
Yeah.
have actually fallen outside the Church, and that there really is only a tiny fragment
Right.
of the true Church remaining on earth. And that's an extraordinary thing to accept. And I think the emotional hurdle of accepting that is the real obstacle.
It's overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's an overwhelming emotional, and also not only emotional, a cognitive hurdle
Yes.
as well. But it is analogous to understanding that we no longer have sovereign national governments, but that
Yes.
BlackRock owns everything. So it's kind of analogous to the red pill process people are going through. People are, our fellow Americans are in such shock now. After the 2020 election, especially, and after the whole COVID scam, we have a critical mass of American people who are just paralyzed by shock because they never realized how bad it really was. You see, and so you have to. I'm very sympathetic. I've never personally denigrated or tried to shame people who left us for the new calendar. I mean, they knew my position. I wasn't going to mince words about the validity of their choice from a theological and soteriological viewpoint. But I always preface my words by saying I understand emotionally and even cognitively how you're so tempted to do this. Right? I understand. Right? On the human level, I get it. I know why you're jumping ship, going back, or going to World Orthodoxy. Or while friends in World Orthodoxy are so reluctant to, even ones who are very sympathetic, are reluctant to join because it's just such a difficult thing. But now what's happening, though, increasingly in society in general, even in the secular realm, people are finding that they're in a state of shock, realizing that so many of the traditional institutions they relied on are Potemkin villages, that they're so hollow, and they've been hollowed out and occupied by malevolent people, and ultimately by demons. But see, one hook that the innovators or the ecumenists, or the subversives, a hook they have on conservative people is that conservative people are the ones who revere the institutions. So it's ironic, right, that the ones who revere the ancient patriarchates the most, the ones who revere the church order the most, the ones who revere church history the most are the old calendarists, who ironically end up being kicked out and anathematized and cursed and denigrated by the people who have now unlawfully occupied, those noble sees, taken those noble names of Pope of Rome or Patriarch of Constantinople or Patriarch of Moscow and so forth. So that's the really difficult part of discernment. And a struggle within true orthodoxy is to retain the Catholic sense of the church. We're not rebels from the church. We're not rebels from the church's history. We are the ones upholding the church, upholding the church's history. We revere the history and the beauty and the order of these venerable institutions. So it's important to maintain that. So the struggle with intra-Orthodoxy, we have an external struggle against the heretics and against the innovators, against the ecumenists, but we have an internal struggle to keep catechizing our own people to remain historically minded Orthodox Christians who realize there isn't some new religion called old calendarism. We're the Orthodox. And we should be the ones who have the most esteem and the most love and preserve the memory of these great historical institutions, both in their theological but also in their cultural manifestations and their historical patriotic manifestations. See? And not just be the weird little goofy sectarians that we are made out to be, and that frankly some of us are, with no historical consciousness. We're just, I'm a true Orthodox, and I don't need no patriarchates. I don't need no national churches. And the cowboy mentality too. It's one of the way a typical slur Europeans use against us Americans, right? The cowboy mentality. So we don't want to have the cowboy mentality or libertarian mentality. We don't want our American libertarian mentality to bleed into our witness, right? We have to remain historically conscious, culturally conscious, retain our veneration for the ancient and venerable institutions of the church, and but at the same time maintain our loving opposition to these criminals who've seized these institutions that we revere and are using them for evil purposes. Okay. All righty.